Hello, this is Joseph Cadotte for Old Sins Reviews. Today we are going to be talking about the Valerian comic, not the movie. If you want a review of the movie, there are all sorts of... Oh, Jesus, I'm sorry about that. We'll wait until he puts that away. Excuse me. There are all sorts of different places to go look at the movie reviews. This is not them. I read the comics in English because I don't particularly care to speak a dying language like French. However, the comics, due to reasons we'll discuss shortly, are probably good for learning French after you're done with your Asterix and Obelix comics. And you want another Franco-Belgian comic. This is probably a good one to pick up and read. Why do I say that? Well, the dialogue is pretty simple, which is both a blessing and a curse, and it's very pretty to look at, and even with my extremely limited understanding of Latinate languages, I could understand some of the words enough to figure out what was happening, and I'm not a student of the language by any stretch. So that is actually a very good thing that's going on in this comic. This is a perfect film for Luc Besson, the director of The Fifth Element, amongst others, to film. Like all of his works, it's extremely pretty. The dialogue is completely disposable, and the ideas are profound if you don't think of them for a while, or for that long. The Fifth Element was heavily influenced by Valerian. You can tell there's a sequence in roughly the 15th or 16th book of taxi cabs flying around and fighting, which seems like it was a storyboard for the opening of The Fifth Element. So there is that. Despite the claims of the authors, the Valerian series doesn't have much to do with Western science fiction. It borrows extremely heavily from it, but it hasn't really influenced it that much. They claim an influence, but the influence is specious at best. For example, they argue that the Millennium Falcon, whose design was based on a hamburger, is based on the design of Valerian's ship. They're somewhat similar, and they only get much more similar after the series, the first Star Wars comes out. So there are fins, for example, which on the ship which decline in size to make the thing more closer match the Millennium Falcon. Not the other way around. So, also, the characters, which I'll go more into later, have almost nothing to do with Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, despite a very angry editorial cartoon drawn by the authors of Valerian. So, you're going to see a lot of articles, probably, or there will be a lot of articles that say that Western American and British science fiction borrowed from Valerian, and frankly, being a scholar of both, that is simply untrue. These are the tropes that they use were well present, well before its 1967 debut. So, again, the dialogue isn't worth writing home about, but it is good and simple to learn how to read with. So I can recommend that. I'm trying to keep my picture on the dog, of course, because Ike is the true star of all of this. So, the characters. Valerian, like almost every other character, is perfectly flat as a character. There's almost no depth to him. In fact, there's only one realized character that I've encountered in reading the 18 books I have thus far, and that is Laureline, who is occasionally graced as being a title character. Sometimes the series is referred to Valerian and Laureline. Other times it's referred to Valerian, the spatio-temporal agent. So, Laureline, her primary job is to be kidnapped and put at risk. When the author remembers that she's capable, she saves the day more than once. But far too often, she does something impetuous, and it's up to Valerian to rescue her. I imagine, for some reason, that, during the sexual revolution and so on, from a Gallic perspective, this was liberated portrayal of women. I can definitely say that is not the case, because Dumas was doing much greater complex and active female characters way back in the 1800s, much more so than these guys did in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. She is an active and intelligent agent, and the only one who really seems to know what she's doing most of the time, if, again, the writers remember her capabilities that she's shown prior to this. The comics are somewhat funny in a very simple way, almost slapstick. I'm not going to say much more on that, but you could find them amusing. The ideas expressed in the comics are not at all complex, although it's very clear the author thinks they're making some sort of grand point. They really aren't. You can tell that this is very much centered in liberal French politics of the 1960s and early 70s. And so if you want a time capsule of French politics from the 60s and 70s, this is a good place to start. As to the time travel problem, for some reason they always end up in the 80s in the 20th century in either New York or Paris, because apparently, like Doctor Who and the British Isles, this is the only time frame and location that actually matter to anybody. So, everything comes back to France or New York for some reason. Would I recommend these? For completionists, yes. For someone who's looking to get very pretty versions of already extant ideas, yes, very much so. The works are, the landscapes and backgrounds especially, are very good. The characters themselves are oddly simple given the complexity of the backgrounds. In fact, it kind of reminds me of Jack Kirby with his, stock characters who could be swapped in and out, all of which look vaguely constipated in Kirby's case. In this case, mildly amused, with incredibly complex and interesting backgrounds, much more so than the characters themselves. So, if you can find them at your local library, go ahead and get them and read them. Will it help you understand the movie? The movie will not have any depth if it's anything like any Luke Besson film before, or if it's anything like the comics. So, kind of. Anyways, this has been Joseph Cadotte for Old Sins Reviews. You're welcome to pick up my books and the books of my Old Sins partner, Elizabeth Kidder, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble,